Hello, and welcome to this session on helping faith communities embrace you and your family. I also like to call it grace based advocacy. My name is Joan Borton, and I represent Luke 14 Exchange. We strengthen families affected by disability through coaching, mentoring, and encouragement. I have a degree in Christian ministries and have been actively involved in faith communities since I was born almost. I am married to Jerry Borton. We've been married about 25 years. He's an ordained minister who also happened to be born with cerebral palsy, and he uses a power wheelchair. Jerry had hoped to join me for this session today, but sadly he couldn't. But he does have another session he's doing in the Family Cafe entitled Disability, Anger, and Hope. I would encourage you to go learn from my witty and wise husband after this session is completed. Well, in those 40 years that I've worked with people with disabilities, I've heard a lot of faith stories. Some stories that have just made my heart sing with joy, and others that just make me cringe with sadness because of the way people have felt engaged by the church. Hopefully, we'll be able to tackle some of those concerns and experiences today. In the Family Cafe link, you'll find a handout for this session. It looks like this. I would invite you to take an opportunity to download that if you would like and follow along. So regardless of what your story might be in terms of a faith community or the disability that engages everyone within your family, we probably have all felt like this at some time. We all want to be welcomed, loved, and embraced, but sometimes we just wish there was a sign hanging up showing, just don't bother here, it's not going to work. Well, I'd never seen a sign like that until we were visiting family in another state. We saw an advertisement for a Nativities Expo, and I collect some nativities from around the world, and so I was excited to go to this expo. We found the church and parked, and as we rolled over and walked to the door, we saw that sign, the blue handicap access with the slash through it. It's like, what in the world? Does this church really say they don't want people with disabilities involved? Well, when we looked a little closer, there was a smaller sign underneath that said, this door was not wheelchair accessible, but if you went down to the next one, you'd find access. And sure enough, we did. Well, we laughed about that sign over the years, but truly, sometimes I just wish it were that easy and obvious to see where we fit and where we don't. So why does this happen? Shouldn't a church, a synagogue, a temple, a house of worship be the one place where we could find acceptance without having to fight for it? On the global level, the Apostle Paul describes churches as the body of Christ. And he talks about how some parts might be the eye, other parts the ear, other part the hand, but that every part is needed to make the body complete. In God's economy, he wants all of us involved. But we know that in real life, that doesn't always happen. That body, that beautiful illustration of the body that Paul uses, is comprised of hundreds, thousands, probably even millions of smaller congregations and local church communities made up of people just like you and me. People who, while we want to serve our Creator and serve others and love them, we sometimes are tired, we're myopic, we just don't see the big picture and we make mistakes. Then on top of that, in every community, there are people who are passionate about some particular segment within their community. Just as we probably have a passion for disability because of our life experiences, there are people who have a passion for those who live in poverty, for those who live without housing, for those who are highly intellectual, to those who are sex trafficked, to those who are a part of needing clean water around the world or hunger. There are so many different issues and ways that the churches can be involved in reaching out to their communities that sometimes it's hard to be heard with everything happening all at once. So I'm sharing that not to discourage you or to make an excuse for why churches may not always effectively minister with people with disabilities. I just want to use that as a reality check to kind of temper our expectations. It really starts with thinking through our expectations. In the disability and special needs world, some people feel that we have a special advantage because of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. Well, I'm sorry to say, if you don't already know, that faith communities were primarily exempted from that act. That, again, is not an excuse, and the reason why that happened is a whole other workshop. But it's important for us to know that we can't just rely on that when it comes to faith communities. Now, if you're listening to this and you don't have disability in your family, but you are part of a typical faith community, let me just encourage you that though the law of the U.S. may not mandate you to involve and welcome people with disabilities, the law of love does. Excuse me. Many years ago, in another state, I met Paula. Paula is a mom of a couple girls who are on the autism spectrum. She really wanted her girls engaged in a church near them, so they started to attend this large suburban megachurch. She went and met with the children's ministry leader, the youth ministry leader, tried to explain her girls and tell the church what they needed to do to have her girls successfully be parts of those age groups. It didn't seem to work. She just felt like nothing was happening. So she came and started chatting with me. Now let me tell you, Paula is an advocate by training, and that's her professional job during the day, and she's good at it. School systems, service systems, they did not want her accompanying their families to meetings because she was a tough one to deal with. And though I didn't at this point have any direct advocacy conversations with her, I can tell you that her demeanor and her tone often intimidated me. But part of my job was to help people affected by disability and their family members to connect with churches and to help churches understand our families and figure out how to together embrace and minister it together. So I agreed to go with Paula to a meeting that she had with the church. This time it was going to be the church staff she'd already talked with, as well as the senior pastor. As we chatted on the drive to the meeting, she said, "I just wish if they didn't want our family there, they'd just tell me." And I said, "Oh, that's not going to happen. Churches don't tell people to leave because they don't want to meet that family's needs." I'm thinking to myself, it may happen that way, but they don't usually use those words so overtly. So we got to the meeting. The church staff that she'd already interacted with were there. We met in the pastor's office. The senior pastor was there as well. The staff were all a little wary of who I was, and I tried to explain to them, as I had done with Paula, that I was not there to choose sides. I was there to listen and to try to help each other understand what the other was saying and see how we could successfully navigate through this challenge. Well, Paula began, as she told me she had done in the past, by sharing with a great deal of passion and even anger at what she'd asked the church staff to do and what had been done. She couldn't find any positives in there. She couldn't hear when the church staff replied and tried to tell her the things they were putting in place. And ultimately she said, I gave the church 2 weeks to do this, and in a school I would have only given them 1 week. Well, I wasn't really sure where we were going to be going in this meeting. And then the senior pastor said, "Paula, we just may not be the church for you and your family. If you need to go find another place, we won't hold any hard feelings." Well, I had to eat my words at never hearing those words before, but that's what Paula's family did. But it wasn't all a big loss. Though Paula's kids' needs were not met as she had hoped at that church, she laid some groundwork that was then built upon when the church asked my coworker and I to come back and help them develop disability ministry that is now flourishing in that church. And Paula's motives weren't wrong to want her girls involved and engaged in the church and trying to help the church understand. I think perhaps sometimes though advocates just become so passionate and engaged in life that they sometimes don't see how to work things in different settings. But I left that meeting feeling like there's got to be a better way to advocate within the church community. Well, I think where you need to start and where I need to start is thinking, what are my expectations? What are our expectations for our family's involvement in a local faith community? Am I simply looking for physical access? Do I need a family restroom so we can take care of needs while we're at church? Do I want a buddy for my child to be able to go to to a Sunday school or a youth program with? Do I want a quiet room for my child to go to when they're overstimulated? Am I looking for a place where I or my child or family member can use their gifts and be welcomed in the church? So think through, what are the things that you really want to accomplish from going to this faith community and being a part of it. Then also think about the size of a faith community that you're looking for. What would work best for your family? A large congregation or a small one? Excuse me. One would think that larger churches would be an easy place for us to slide right in and get involved. Well, if it's a large group activity that we want to be a part of, that's probably true. But remember that churches are organizations. And while a larger church may have more potential volunteers to draw from, they also probably have a lot more staff, individuals, and committees through which decisions or programs need to be reviewed, processed, and approved before they can be implemented. So it could take longer in a larger church. Smaller churches tend to excel at seeing people's needs before they see program needs. They may have a smaller pool of volunteers to draw from, but they also could be much nimbler and able to adjust quicker to the needs that they see in their congregation. So once you identify your expectations, prioritize them. Nobody can do everything at once. Choose the one that you think is most important, or perhaps the one that might be easiest to achieve, because getting a success under your belt will both spur you and the church leadership on to try new things. It will build momentum. So once you've declared your expectations or written them down or expressed them to within your family, and you've prioritized them, then you can begin to think about advocating. I can hear some of you now, even though it's a virtual seminar, thinking, wait, it sounds like you're asking too much of me. I'm exhausted, I'm tired, I just want to be able to go to a place where for an hour I can have my child go to Sunday school and I can go to worship and get a little bit of refreshment. Now it sounds like you're telling me I have to be involved. Yes, my friend, I am telling you that. It's not fair, is it? Nope. But we are the ones who know our loved one the best. And very few pastors, priests, rabbis, rectors have had any ministerial training in disability at all. Since they don't know what they don't know, they can't teach the rest of their gathering. My friend Mary, who has a son with significant disabilities, asked me to remind families that we especially need to have mercy on the church leadership, because we wouldn't have known that families affected by disability need to be included in the church if it weren't for our own experiences with our children. It's helpful to ponder how we might have responded and thought if we hadn't had children with disabilities. Mary says it makes her sad to think what she might have thought if she had not had Jonathan. I'm afraid I would console myself that there aren't many families that are affected by disability because I don't see them in the church, and that somebody else, the government or somebody, was providing the support the families need. Now, should I give you a minute to stop snickering at the idea that people think the government or other sources meet all of our needs? That's very, as you probably know, that's a thought that's promulgated very, very frequently out in the community. So we know the need for a faith community for families affected by disability. There are hundreds of families around us who don't know that value. Mary goes on to say, churches have no idea that there's an enormous mission field of families who have a family member with special needs. And these houses of worship are unaware of the fact that their facilities, programs, and culture are fraught with barriers that are too difficult to hurdle for most families impacted by disability. It is because of Jonathan that I know these things. God has used my experience as Jonathan's mom and the opportunities this role has afforded me to interface with other parents who have children with disabilities to develop a deep desire to help other families just like mine. Excuse me. We need to understand and accept that we may need to be a part of breaking the ice or laying the initial foundation, the initial building blocks for a program or ministry that reaches people with disabilities. It's sort of a bit like the Field of Dreams movie. If we build it, or even help to build it, they will come. Throughout the history of people who have needed advocates, most often the initial advocates have come from within themselves. Think about Harriet Tubman, Susan B. Anthony, and Martin Luther King Jr. So let's talk about a bit about advocacy and how it might get accomplished, and then we'll talk about grace and explore how those two can work together. The Center for Excellence in Disabilities at West Virginia University defines autism this way. Defines advocacy this way: promoting the interests or causes of someone or a group of people. An advocate is a person who argues for, recommends, supports a cause or policy. Advocacy is also about helping people find their voice. There are 3 types of advocacy: self-advocacy, individual advocacy, and systems advocacy. There are many ways to accomplish the act of advocacy: sit-ins, hunger strikes, protest marches, putting up signs, attending meetings, acting on behalf of another, lobbying, educating, researching, organizing, influencing voters, and litigation. In the world of disability, advocacy may take all of these forms. Sometimes paid advocates, or those who have spent a lifetime advocating, may become jaded. Having fought the good fight for so long, they may lose sight of the fact that every hurdle cannot be addressed the same way. There's also some people of faith who may be hesitant to engage in advocacy because they feel like their mandate is to live at peace with everyone. Some may even feel advocacy conflicts with their belief system. I'd like to share 3 examples from the scriptures that show me that advocacy is a faith-based concept. In its simplest form, advocates are helpers. In the Old Testament book of Proverbs, chapter 31, verses 8 and 9, we read, "Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and needy." Jesus' life itself is also an example of advocacy. He led his life in the service of others, even to the point of being willing to give his own life. He told his disciples that when he left this world, he would send a helper, an advocate he called him, the Holy Spirit, and he did. Then I was intrigued one day when I was reading the Old Testament. I was in the prophet Jeremiah, chapter 32, verse 24, when I saw this statement: "See how the siege ramps have been built against the city walls." Siege ramps? That caught my attention because of what I do for a living, working with people with disabilities. I was compelled to take a deeper look. The ramps in this situation were being constructed for an army to overtake the city. In the biblical times, there was typically only one way to enter the city or to leave it, and that was through the lone city gate. That gate usually led to a maze of hallways and other gates, and that allowed for the guards to assess and to deal with or prepare for anybody who was entering the city for less than peaceful reasons. They could see them come in the outside of the gate. It would take them time to get through before they got to the inner part of the gate. These gates were so massive that people actually lived within the walls that marked the city. If an army wanted to overtake the city, they wouldn't have success just going through the city gates. So instead they built siege ramps, sort of like a rocky hillside. They built these these siege ramps in a slow process. It took a while to bring all that dirt and get it mounted up to the right angle. It would sometimes take them months or years, but it was the best way to achieve their goals. Well, with the Jeremiah passage fresh in my mind, I wondered what it would look like if we intentionally built gracious siege ramps. These ramps would not be to launch a coup against the church, but they would build a pathway of grace-based advocacy. Good ramps rise gradually but they rise steadily. Sometimes they even have a resting place along the way for someone to catch their breath if it's a long path to go up on the ramp. This reminds me that we need to pace ourselves when we are advocating within faith communities. It's not just a simple, quick, get it done. A safe ramp is also wide and has guardrails on it for protection. This helps me remember that there are parameters that we need to work within as we advocate. Could these ramp building procedures or principles teach us how to advocate and how to encourage a church to embrace people with disabilities? How about if we stopped looking at advocacy as a fight, but began to exercise it as a faith mandate to speak up for one another? You've heard me say I like to subtitle this session Grace-Based Advocacy. So what is grace, and how does that look to advocate from a foundation of grace? Well, some would answer the question that grace is a prayer that we offer before a meal, and that is true. That's one way to use the term. But grace is also thought of as unmerited favor, God's unmerited favor toward us. It's something we don't deserve, but He gives us anyway. We understand that we're recipients of grace, or when we understand that, then we can in turn pass it on. For our purposes today, I'm going to use just a concise 2-word definition of grace. It comes from dictionary.com. Courteous goodwill. Okay, so how can we, as families affected by disability, build hypothetical siege ramps of courteous goodwill within the faith community? First, it begins with understanding that the goals of faith communities are different than the goals of the schools and the service systems for people affected by disability. In those arenas, one of the goals is to help people become as independent as possible. Within faith communities, the goal is interdependence. Remember that scripture I referenced earlier from the Apostle Paul about the body of Christ? That illustration shows us that we need all the parts to work together. The eye can't operate without the hand being operational too, to have a full, healthy body. So whether you are a part of the body that is internal that we can't see or outside, nobody has a greater significance. We need to all be complete. That's interdependence. That's the goal of faith communities. Another difference is that within schools, mainstreaming, inclusion, least restrictive environments are usually sought after. Whatever the current buzzword is, we strive for social integration. That's a really noble goal. However, if a faith community's only goal was to integrate people, they would miss their own purpose. Within a faith community, the goal is to teach people the tenets of their faith, introduce them to the source of that faith, and then help them facilitate the growth in faith, and then use that faith to serve others. Okay, so we need to remember that the goals are different between faith communities and the typical service system. Another way that we can advocate with grace is to not do it alone. Find a partner to come alongside you. It might be another family who has a member with a disability. It might be another person, just a typical church member, who enjoys you and your family and wants to be there to help stand up for you. Having someone else join with you builds a support team right from the start. It broadens the level of influence you have with people that you both know and are talking with. And then it helps that when we are so tired, most of us living with disability are exhausted. And when we are overtired, our wit, our words, and our tone may become more acerbic than we'd like them to be. So when we have a buddy or a partner working with us, they can pray for us and they can be the mouthpiece, the one to speak up when it's too close to us to be able to talk about it gracefully. Also, by serving as a mouthpiece, this helps the leadership see that you're not the only one wanting this change to happen. Another way you can advocate with grace is to share your family's life, the real life. Invite someone from the ministerial staff or a lay person or a new friend you've met and their family to come to your house for coffee, for a barbecue, or maybe just a simple visit. I can promise you they're not going to come looking for a magazine spread home. You don't have to be house beautiful. They want to get to know your family, your genuine family. So let them see the marks in the walls. Let them see the tantrums, the tics, the developing social skills that your kids are working on, who you really are. This can go a long way to helping to break down barriers and help the people within your church begin to see and understand why you may request some extra support or adaptations. Excuse me. I'd also like to encourage you to be willing to try some out-of-the-box methods or encourage the church to. I like the story Emily Colson tells about her son Max. You've probably heard this before, but Max was born with autism, and for several years they went to church when he was really young. As he got older, it became much harder for him to go, so they had a period of several years where they were not in church. But Emily and her family continued to impart spiritual lessons to Max, and there was a time when he was in his teens that he made a personal profession of his own faith. When that happened, Emily began to think that it was time to get Max back into church. But how could they do that? So she thought back, what if we did the part of church that he enjoyed the most? The end of the service. So that's what they did. The next Sunday, Emily and Max showed up just as the congregation was being released from the sanctuary. People were piling out the doors to go to their cars or stopping at the coffee bar to get another cup before they went on their way. Max and Emily were greeted by a few people. They got their coffee. And the next thing Emily knew, Max was over joining what they called the grunt team, the people who were picking up chairs and putting them away. At the end of that time, another volunteer on that team came up and clasped Max on the shoulder and said, Max, you did a great job today. You're welcome to join the grunt team anytime. That made Max's day. From that week on, they continued to go for Max to serve on the grunt team at the end of church, but every week Emily would add a few more minutes and a few more minutes to the time they arrived, until now they're able to go for the whole service. And Max is fully engaged in the worship and in many places throughout the church where he's using his gifts, as Emily calls it, the gift of vacuuming, the spiritual gift of vacuuming in the church. Excuse me. Though we're tired, we need to also still invest in the life of someone else within the church. We want to be able to be givers as well as takers, okay? Other people's lives are exhausting too. We just don't always see it because we see our own life so close in front of us that we miss seeing the others. I'm not suggesting that you need to take a meal to every person who has a medical need, or drive somebody to every appointment that they get, or provide money to somebody. What is something simple? Think of just one thing that is simple that you could do. Is it shooting a text once a week to somebody just to say you've thought about them, or how are they doing, or you're praying? Something that will build relationships. You never know that over time, the person you're investing in may become one of your advocates within the church body too. And as an advocate, we need to remember when we're advocating with grace to express gratitude. No one will ever be able to meet your loved one's needs the way you can. We just need to understand that. Nobody can replace a mom, a wife, a dad, whoever you might be in that person's life, okay? But if we expect somebody to do it exactly the way we do, we'll always be disappointed. So when you see somebody making an effort, thank them. Express your gratitude that they made an effort and they tried. As you continue to do that and develop that, you'll have opportunities to build new strategies into them as they seek to interact with you and your family member as well. So let them know you appreciate the effort they made. And then maybe this should have come first, but commit to grace-based or courteous goodwill in your advocacy. Avoid ultimatums and assume the best. unless things are proven otherwise. And then you need to deal with it in love, honestly. But assume the best and avoid ultimatums. And remember that that grace, that courteous goodwill applies to you. There are times I've blown it. There's probably going to be times you will too. We need to practice that forgiveness for ourselves as well as for those people in the churches and faith communities that we are interacting in. We're not always going to get it right the first time. I wish I could tell you that if you use these steps, that you would have a foolproof method of getting your loved one in the church in exactly the way you'd like them to be. Sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes the fit just isn't right for a number of different reasons between a particular church or faith community and an individual or family. When that happens, we may need to leave and find another church. But I would encourage you to use that as a last step and not a first step. Okay, and then if we do need to make a change of church, please beware and watch what you might say or do in regards to that church. Just because one church didn't work for you doesn't mean it won't work for another family. Like happened with Paula's, it didn't work for her, but as the church grew and continued to develop disability ministry, it's worked for many, many other families. So give some grace and some latitude there. Just as people change, churches change. Okay? Now, some of you who are listening, again, maybe don't have any member of your family with a disability, but you represent a faith community. So may I share a few grace-based tips with you as well? First, I would encourage you to get to know us, get to know our families who are affected by disability. It might be a little bit unusual or scary to you at first if you don't know anybody personally with a disability, but we want to get to know other people. We want to make it easier for you. So please ask us questions, share with us. If you find that we don't always respond really well at first, know that that could be because we have been disappointed so many times. We really need to build that trust before we share too broadly or too deeply with you. Listen to what we say that's beyond our words. Sometimes the first thing we see or hear may not really be what we meant to say or what's really going on. We just needed to either blow off some steam, or I know some people do that to kind of test and to see if you're going to still stick with us when you find out this really kind of random or difficult thing about our lives. Confess what you don't know. Okay, we want to understand that you don't know about disability. There's a lot of things you know about that we don't know about. So confess what you don't know, but your desire to learn. Again, ask us for help, ask questions, and don't worry about tripping over your words if you show us your heart. Words can be tricky. They change all the time. Most families affected by disability I know won't be offended if you use the wrong word, as long as we can see that you're asking not to be able to pigeonhole us, but to be able to embrace us and engage with us and get to know us. And then again, be honest. If we ask you for something that you know just can't happen right now or has been tried before and didn't work for whatever reason, don't lead us along. Don't tell us you'll check on it and get back to us. Be honest. We can deal with that. And then together we can try to help maybe another solution, find another solution that will be workable for everyone. And then remember that the person with a disability is a person. Make direct eye contact, use their name, interact with them, don't leave them out. So in conclusion, for everyone, families or churches, we build disability ministry in a church or in a faith community with an appropriate amount of honesty mixed with kindness or courteous goodwill on the part of everyone. Families, if as this session wraps up, you're feeling more overwhelmed and exhausted because of things you have to do, may I remind you that this is a marathon and not a sprint. We acknowledge that life is not fair, but you have every right to advocate on your own, at your own pace. The ideas I've shared with you aren't all meant to be done in a day or a week or even a month. Okay, take your time, work on that courteous goodwill and sharing in the time frame that you have to be able to do that. I'd like to thank you all for joining me. If we were face to face right now, I would open up the remainder of our time together for you to tell me your stories. I love hearing your faith stories or any other story you feel the need to share and want to share. So, whether your story worked well or whether your story kind of ended up a little closer to Paula's story initially, please feel free to share them with me. You can email me at Joan, Joan, at Luke, Luke 14, the numbers 1 4, Luke14exchange.org. You can share your story in the email. You can schedule a time that we could talk. Whatever we could do at Luke 14 Exchange to be able to listen to you, to coach you, to offer training, whether you're a family or a faith community member, we want to be here for you. Thanks again for coming. Enjoy the rest of your day.